I also wanted to point out that I don't know how this came about, but that the Children's Health Defense is actually putting on I don't know if it's an annual conference or just a conference at the same venue in the same right following our conference starting on that Sunday. And as far as I can see, the Children's Health Defense Conference is billed as a unity conference, unifying this so-called freedom movement. I also wanted to point out the Children's Health Defense runs a sort of base camp, a sort of forum where people can share ideas. And what's so interesting to me about this is if you look at that, you see an increased amount of vitriol, some of which is directed personally at me. So as an example, I'm not sure who, but I think it was Hammond, referred to me as a cancer on the freedom movement. And then Lyons Weiler posted I think it was 8 or 9 points of why we were incorrect, specifically me. I bring that up because I don't know the percentage of people in the so-called freedom movement who are now coming to the realization that SARS-CoV-2 specifically doesn't exist and there is no such thing as pathogenic viruses. But I can tell you it's a large percentage and growing by the day. And I can also say there is no chance of having a unity conference, considering the fact that nobody who can explain that point of view has been invited to speak at the Children's Health Defense Conference. So I wanted to just take a minute to actually show what Lyons Weiler wrote, and then make a comment on, am I in fact the cancer on the freedom movement? So here is basically what he said, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because all these things we've pretty much gone over, so I just wanted to make a few comments. The first one, though, was number 2. There are other causal frameworks that have emerged that are ignored, such as the Bradford-Hill criteria. In other words, this man who claims he's a scientist who is claiming that viruses exist is proposing that we consider at least using these criteria to prove the existence of the virus. That's my guess. So let's look at those criteria. And I got this, as you can see, from Wikipedia. And again, I don't want to go through the whole thing, but the most interesting one to me is number 8, which says experiment. So the rest of these are basically looking at epidemiology to find links between certain phenomena that you observe and trying to ascertain the cause. But number 8 is the crux of the matter. So with an experiment, quote, occasionally it is possible to appeal to experimental evidence. Now, when we're talking about viruses, which is what we're talking about, because there's no experience that any human being has of a virus directly, there's no clinical virology. You can't say, oh, this person has this symptoms, therefore that's the proof that this was caused by a virus. You can't even show the existence of the virus by any of these other methods, like something happened before something else happened. Obviously, in a case of something that you can't see and you have no sensory input as to whether that thing is real, you have to do an experiment. And so to suggest that a valid way of proving the existence of a virus is, quote, occasionally to appeal to experimental evidence, is very hard to understand why you would say that and how you would say that, and then in this next breath claim somehow you're doing science. So that was one. Then they say, number three, direct evidence that the virus has been isolated, and they keep raising the bar. This is clearly not true. We have said all along that there is a way to find something and demonstrate that something exists. It works with trees, it works with frogs, it works with bacteria, it works with tiny little nanoparticles that analytical chemists can find. They go to the natural habitat of that thing, that organism, or that tree, or that frog, or that key, or that credit card, or that nanoparticle, or whatever it is. They look for direct evidence that you can find it in its natural habitat. And then if they can't find it by direct sensory observation, like seeing it, they do very careful experiments, making sure at every step of the experimental process that they're very careful to do control experiments to make sure that there is no possibility, zero possibility, that any of their testing is creating the effect that they're observing. We've said that from the very beginning, and specifically about viruses. You go to the natural habitat of this pathogenic virus, which in the case of SARS-CoV-2 is obviously the lung of a person you say has COVID. And there you do the techniques called, you extract the fluid, you filter it, you put it on a ultracentrifuge, density grade centrifuge, you find the band where the viruses spin out, you suck that out, you confirm that you have only those pathogenic viruses in an electron microscope, and then you can do experiments using that purified virus. We have said that from the beginning, and they have failed to come up with one example of that for SARS-CoV-2 or any other so-called pathogenic virus. We then said that obviously if you can't do it that way, which would make it the only thing that we say exists that I can think of, that you can't actually find in its habitat. And of course, they make up all kind of excuses like it's not there enough, which then begs the question of how is it causing disease? If you can't find it directly and you have to do things like cell cultures, you better make sure that every step of that cell culture you have controlled for to make sure nothing in the process is creating the effect, in this case, the breakdown of the cells. In fact, if you're a real scientist, why wouldn't you want to do that? Why wouldn't you even solicit? Is there anybody else out there who can think of another way to disprove that it's the virus causing the cytopathic effect? Could it be the chemical in the viral transport medium? Maybe, so let's control for that. Could it be the temperature? Could it be anything? Why wouldn't you want to know that? And instead, all we get is excuses about why they don't even want to do control experiments. And the final thing I'll comment on is number 8. There's no answer from them other than anger when it's pointed out that bacteriophage, what they admit exist, are viruses. I did a whole webinar on this. Bacteriophages are not virus. They probably do exist. It's possible they're an electron microscope artifact, but I don't think so. The reason they're not viruses, I was very clear about this, is when you stress bacteria in a culture, They take on a spore-like form where they coalesce into a tiny structure, which is about the size and consistency of what we are calling viruses, which therefore proves that you can actually find things the size and morphology and the composition of what we're claiming are viruses. So that proves that finding them is not a technical problem, them being the viruses. And so bacteriophages are not viruses. They are spore-like forms of stressed bacteria, and therefore they can't possibly prove that viruses exist because they don't fit the definition of a virus. For instance, they don't self-replicate. They just come from the breakdown of, or the coalescence of the bacteria when they're stressed. Very similar to the misconception of what a virus is, which is just the breakdown product of stressed tissues. So when you stress a tissue, it forms basically cellular debris, which is confused for viruses. And when you stress bacteria, it breaks down into something called bacteriophages, which proves that you can find them. And it also proves the point that every single thing, even something as small as a bacteriophage, the way you find it is you go to the natural habitat. In this case, it's a bacterial culture, and then you purify, which has been done many times for phages. You purify the phage directly out of the habitat, and the only one you can't do that with, the only thing that I'm aware of, is viruses, because they don't exist. Now, the question is, how are we in this so-called freedom movement going to deal with this division? Before I do that, I said I would say something about, in fact, am I the cancer in the freedom movement? And my comment on that was apparently whoever said that, I think Hammond, must have read my book where I described actually the dynamics of what we mean by cancer. Now, I'll make an assumption here, which I'll be very clear about. I think when they're referring to cancer, they're talking about the tumor. So like the breast tumor or the pancreas tumor. That's what we're calling the cancer. And as I clearly outlined and has been explained by many people for a really long time, the problem with cancer is the organism has been poisoned or disturbed or psychologically affected, or something toxic has happened to the organism. Rather than having that toxicity be pervasive in the organism and perhaps killing the organism, and could be a person, it could be an animal, could be even a plant, does an amazing therapeutic step, which is to coalesce this poison, this debris, into essentially a kind of garbage receptacle, which is what we call the tumor. In other words, the tumor is the attempt to heal the toxic organism. So while I would actually say that I'm maybe flattered to say that I am the cancer of the freedom movement, in other words, I am there to heal the freedom movement, to essentially coalesce the toxicity so that the body can actually deal with it. I think that's actually a bit of a stretch, and there's a lot of us doing this. So I don't think this is really about whether I'm the one who's doing this. But given this reality, it's very clear that we have a very toxic movement. And because of that, somebody needs to try to heal this. And just like the cancer tumor is the body's attempt to heal the toxic condition of the body, apparently we're being told that we're the force, we're the part that's trying to heal this movement of its toxic misconceptions that is the foundation of this whole COVID narrative, that it's all based on a virus which simply doesn't exist. And let me finish by just saying that if we want to have a conference that's about healing the divisions and coalescing the movement and uniting the movement, we need to do some work in order to make that a reality, instead of excluding a huge percentage of the people who are simply not buying the usual science and language of essentially all of the speakers at this CHD conference. So what I'm going to suggest in order to start this healing is that Bobby Kennedy invite Andy and Mark Bailey and myself for maybe the usual 60 to 90 minute session on his podcast, where we explain to the listeners of the Children's Health Defense the science of virology, and he's free to ask us whatever challenging questions he wants. And we will lay out the case for the fact that the scientific reality principles are squarely in our court, and these pathogenic viruses have not been proven, and this should be the foundation of all of the freedom activities for this freedom community. Because if freedom is not based on the truth, you will end up in the dilemma that you find yourself in now, because this will be very difficult for the scientific board of Children's Health Defense to get on board with this. On the other hand, if you don't, a more and more percentage of the people in the freedom community will go elsewhere to find their information and for their places they can support. And as far as I can see, the only way out of this dilemma is to seek the truth and let the truth come forth, and then let the chips fall where they may. And any kind of excuse that this will hurt our standing, our funding, or that it's not based on whatever, doesn't matter, because freedom can only be based on the truth. And that's what we're trying to do here. And so why not let the facts come out? And that, I think, would be a start in doing this.